Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us across all these video platforms here today. Fun show on tap for you, including, to kick things off here in a moment, Kirby Smart acknowledging what a lot of Georgia fans are also saying, too, that when you look at what Georgia's getting ready to play here in 2024, very, very tough schedule and very important task for Georgia, being ready for the tough games coming up. So exactly how is Georgia doing that? Well, we'll get a chance to talk about that some here today. Also, a very notable name from the NFL. High praise for a former Georgia great. We'll give you that, and we'll make it relevant for this current Georgia team there, too. Connor Riley stops by. A whole lot to enjoy over the course of our time together here today. So what do you say we get ready to get rolling? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro, cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
One of the things we've said a little bit over the course of the last couple of days is that the stuff that we've heard from Kirby Smart, we don't always hear from him a ton during the offseason, but some of the stuff that we've heard from him in a couple of recent media appearances are interesting in that they very much mirror, we believe, the ongoing conversation that Georgia fans are having with each other. They're getting together at the lake, or they're playing golf, or they're going fishing, or they're hanging out by the pool coming up pretty soon. And as college football fans, Georgia fans do what they do, have discussions about their favorite team. A lot of what we believe those fan conversations are going to be sounding like, that's also some of the stuff that you're also hearing from Kirby Smart right now there as well. And I just at least find that to be interesting, if nothing else. And perhaps we have another example of that here today. You know, last week, Kirby Smart was at that celebrity golf tournament known as the Regions Tradition. It's the PGA Tour Champions event, one of their majors that takes place in the suburban Birmingham area. Smart always plays in the event. And while he was there, in addition to some clips we gave you last week, he was also on the Paul Finebaum show. So Finebaum recorded that last week, and they played it yesterday. And in the midst of this discussion with Paul Finebaum, and we'll put a link to the interview when we post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com later on, Kirby Smart was asked about the perception of his team, the likelihood they'll be the preseason number one and kind of viewed as the favorite to win the national championship. But in answering that question, Kirby Smart also acknowledged one of the big challenges facing Georgia that is the kind of thing that most fans have noticed. And when fans are talking about Georgia football right now, the things that they are saying, once again, sound very, very similar to one of the things that Kirby Smart is also saying, too. So let me give you a chance to hear this. Kirby Smart to Paul Finebaum yesterday when being asked about being the favorite to win this year's national championship.
We'll be the favorite in some people's eyes. Some people find things wrong with us. We got a really hard schedule. We play 3 top 15 teams on the road in our conference. That's tough. But we've got a good football team. We've got a very consistent football team. We say it all the time. We're built to sustain at Georgia. We don't want to be a one-hit wonder. We don't want to live and die through the portal. We want to grow our players from signing with us, make them better, and then give them an opportunity at the next level and to be better contributors to society. So I don't think we're going to have a good football team next year. I don't know how good, and I don't know how we'll play on some really tough road games, but we'll see where it falls.
So once again, really interesting stuff there. Kirby Smart from the Paul Finebaum show, sounding a lot like Georgia fans have sounded, because we have this conversation every single day. I talk to you, you talk back to me, we talk with each other. You're talking in your own circles with your own Georgia fan friends. And the one thing that Georgia fans have been saying ever since we had the ability to kind of look ahead to what this year was going to be, the one thing that fans have been saying is, man, that is a tough schedule here in 2024. You could mention the Clemson game. You could mention a lot of things. Kirby Smart focuses it, and you'll watching a video, you'll see this there on the screen. These really tough road games at Alabama, the scenario around that game, the fact that Alabama, even with Kalen DeBoer as head coach, is going to be a relatively high-ranked team. At Texas, we would make a case this may be among the biggest regular season games that Georgia's ever played, given the prestige of the opponent, given the circumstances around their arrival into the SEC, given the stakes for Georgia. This is about as big as it gets. But even November 9th going to Ole Miss, historically when these two teams have played, hasn't always been a gigantic game. But this year, Ole Miss is expected to be a preseason top 10 team. Ole Miss has playoff aspirations. And that late in the season, November 9th, the date the game is scheduled, whatever Ole Miss is going to be, the chance to kind of fulfill some of the potential they have, it may come down to a game like that against Georgia. So Kirby Smart acknowledging these big road games as one of the real stiff challenges awaiting Georgia here this season. Now, with all of that said, let me also take a moment to kind of acknowledge this. And you've heard me say this before, perhaps. It's always interesting to me what Kirby Smart chooses to talk about. And you got to sometimes listen closely to kind of notice this. Because when Kirby Smart, is asked about being the favorite, he kind of pivots that to, yeah, but look at the schedule, look at the teams that we're playing. And what that tells me is of his own free will, of his own volition, Kirby Smart chooses to talk about the schedule. That if he didn't want to talk about the schedule, he wouldn't have to. He could say something to the effect of, oh, I ain't worried about our schedule. I'm just worried about, getting as good as we can be right here today. Win this day. We'll worry about September when that gets here. I haven't even looked at the schedule. I don't even know who we're playing. Somebody's going to have to tell me, the opponents. I'm not even looking at that right now. We're trying to recruit. We're trying to do all this kind of stuff. Like if Kirby Smart, and I'm not making fun of him, I'm just saying that's when he wants to talk that way, that's how Kirby Smart talks. That if he didn't want to talk about the schedule, he could find some way to sort of pivot away from that and not talk about that. But the fact that Kirby Smart does want to talk about the schedule, the fact that he volunteers of, hey, Paul, have you seen the schedule we're playing? Have you seen these road games we're playing? The fact that Kirby Smart volunteers that as a discussion point leads me to believe that he sees some value in discussing the fact that there are these big games on the schedule here this year. Perhaps he sees that as an extra source of motivation. Perhaps he sees that as a way of kind of demanding an extra level of focus from his team or whatever his reasoning is. It seems like Kirby Smart goes there on this topic, speaks about the tough schedule because he sees some value in acknowledging, man, these big games, these tough opponents, this tricky, road schedule to navigate here. All of a sudden, by bringing that up right now, he's only kind of raising the stakes for his team, and it's preseason preparation to be ready for all of that. Just kind of an interesting piece of insight into perhaps how Kirby Smart thinks about this type of stuff. But if you're a fan, you've been thinking about this and talking about this now for months. And so your question is, as we sort of move from what has been the way too early college football conversation to what it sort of feels like in this kind of summer vibe, which is now it's just preseason. It's not way too early anymore. We're not looking ahead to something that's going to happen 9 months from now. We're talking about something that's going to happen in some cases in a few weeks, in some cases a couple of months, right? This is sort of, now it's not the distant future, it's just the near future. And so as we kind of get a little closer to all of this, the question becomes, okay, well, what does Georgia do to get ready for all this? How does Georgia prepare for the challenge of knowing that on paper, this is probably the toughest schedule that Georgia's ever played? Well, I would say that this is a very good year for Georgia to have something true about itself that does appear to be true. Now, I try not to beat you all over the head with too many heavy stats and things like that because that becomes, in some cases, not very conversational at times. So we try to be careful about that. But I did notice that y'all know who Bill Connelly is. He's the stat guru guy. He works for ESPN now. And one of the things that he does every year, and he uses a formula. This is not just, basic arithmetic. There's a formula and some stuff like that goes into this. But his returning production, this is sort of his replacement for the old idea of who's a returning starter in college football. Connelly thinks about this more along the lines of the total stats that a team produces in a given year. How many of the players responsible for producing those stats return in the next year, or guys that were productive from another team, kind of factoring into this too. The overall percentage of returning production with some positions being slightly more valuable than others, things like that. Well, given the way the transfer portal in the spring is shaking out and things like that, Bill Connelly kind of, retabulated his returning production stats here. And Georgia has now moved up 19 spots on this list. They were 47th in America based on the percentage of offensive and defensive production stat line from a year ago coming back here this year. But now they're up to 28 in the overall FBS. There's 133 teams now in FBS. Georgia's 28th here with 68% of its total production from 2023 returning for the upcoming season. That's higher than the 65% from when they did this back in February. So in other words, Georgia is now one of the more veteran teams returning in college football, bringing back, more returning production than a lot of the teams in America, and frankly, a good bit more than it had a year ago. So I would say that kind of experience, that kind of returning production, this is a pretty good year to have something like that. And obviously offensive line starts and quarterback and things like that, of course, factor into all this. Warren Brinson is your Stackhouse coming back. There's a lot of names we can attach to this, how it is that Georgia has a decent amount of returning production, more so than it did a year ago, more so than most teams in college football. We can sort of start to figure some of this kind of stuff out. But if you really kind of look at, well, how is it that Georgia is set up to navigate the tough schedule that's on the way, you sort of start with that very good year to have a veteran presence or two here on this team. Even if you did lose some big names from a year ago, still nice to have some guys coming back. And by the way, some of that experience is what we think of as the tried and true starters. But some of this are just guys that have kind of played in a role for Georgia before, and perhaps they have a chance at an expanded role here this year. This is where I'll go back to something else that Kirby Smart said at the golf tournament last week. The notion of what the entire offseason has been about for them is keeping those productive players in the program, keeping them happy and content to stay here at UGA, gives them a chance to develop there as well. Once again, this is something last week that Kirby was kind of willing of his own free will to talk more about, which gives you an idea into how important he thinks this is. So how does Georgia plan to prepare for this very tough schedule that's on the way? Kirby Smart gave you a little bit of a glimpse into that last week.
Well, the biggest thing is getting our players better. We're trying to grow our depth, and we spend a lot of time on our 2s and 3s throughout spring practice. We kind of say if you've played over 500 snaps, we see you as a returning starter, and we got quite a few guys that fit that mold. And the deal was, can we build up the rest of our roster? How do we retain them? How do we sell that you might be a 2 now, but you're closer to going to the NFL draft from here as a 2 than you are at our neighbor school as a 1. And the development piece is probably what we sell the most.
So let's see if we can kind of sum all of this up and bring this together. There is no doubt about it. What you've noticed, Kirby Smart has noticed there as well. Oh, my goodness, this schedule for Georgia this year is fascinating. It's a Clemson game neutral site to begin. It's a Clemson game. We're hearing something coming through here. It's a Clemson game neutral site to begin the year. It's a road game at Alabama. It's a road game at Texas. It's a road game at Ole Miss. It's a game against Tennessee, which has proven to be one of the more interesting ones that Georgia plays. You can kind of go through and sort of figure all this out and look at it closely. There is a lot of very, very tough games on this 2024 Georgia schedule. You've got to make sure you're ready for that if you are UGA. Kirby Smart describes right there in clear terms how it is that Georgia is getting ready for this. They're keeping their players in the program. They're keeping them happy. They're keeping large numbers of them from transferring. And while they're here, they're developing. They're getting better. They're preparing for their chance in the NFL. But as they do that, they're also preparing to do battle with an SEC that is expanded and deeper than it's ever been before. But if you listen closely to Kirby Smart here, it certainly sounds like Georgia has a very good chance to be ready for what's on its way. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We are happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us. Video platforms, all of them. They're 10 a.m. radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, Apple, Spotify, all the other platforms. Hosting the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. Always a great way to do that. And some of the stuff that you hear us talk about, you'll see links to some of that there at DawgNation.com if you want more information on that. We give all that to you. And we're just glad to have you with us for it all here today. Also, big thanks to our friends at ServPro for making this possible. Other day I was driving into work and, pulling off the highway, getting off the exit, getting ready to come in here to our palatial DawgNation World Headquarters studios. And as I looked across and I saw a big, truck next to me, I looked over and said, well, that's ServPro. Just out there, just taking care of business and doing real work, helping people in a time of need. And I love that. I love the fact that during this portion of the show, I'm able to talk to you about companies or, in some cases, individual people who are going to do good things for you and going to meet you in a moment in which you really need someone to come to your rescue. And that's what the restoration specialists of ServPro are all about. Because if you've owned property, whether it's the home you live in or the commercial property where your business is housed or something along those lines, if it's damaged by fire, if water kind of breaks out where it's not supposed to be, flooding of some sort, well, you want that mess cleaned up. And when you initially see it, you're sort of left to wonder, can this ever be cleaned up? We're going to have to move. We're going to have to just sort of abandon this place. Well, no, there's always a way to get it cleaned up, and our friends at ServPro understand that. That's what their restoration specialists are all about. Plus, every ServPro franchise, independently owned and operated. We love that about them, that they've got that vested interest in the outcome positively for you, the same way you're hoping for that yourself. That's what ServPro wants to provide for you. So please, reach out and find them online. It's servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com for more on that today. Okay, so we got Connor Riley here coming up in just a moment. We'll talk to Connor about some of the stuff we were just discussing, about what Kirby Smart said here over the last little bit. That's going to be fun. But prior to that, I want to go around the doghouse. And this is sort of just for fun. I believe this is the first time we've ever mentioned Des Bryant here on the show. Obviously, a receiver in the NFL of some fame, not always for the right reasons, perhaps necessarily, but an interesting figure nonetheless. Well, Bryant was on a recent podcast interview, kind of, I guess, emanating out of Las Vegas. And one of the things that came up from Bryant is his belief, apparently, in what Brock Bowers has a chance to be for the Las Vegas Raiders. Obviously, we saw Bowers get drafted there. Some Georgia fans were kind of left to wonder, wait, is this a good situation for Bowers? Kind of uncertain about quarterback, and I guess maybe some uncertainty with the organization overall. Some Georgia fans not quite so sure. But Des Bryant seems to think that the Raiders are going to be very glad eventually to have Bowers on their roster. I'm going to show you this. I saw this, I guess, on Instagram from UGA Wire. So the caption here says that Des Bryant already considers Brock Bowers as a future Hall of Famer. Bryant says, I think Bowers was probably a top 3 talent coming out of that draft. He's a Hall of Fame tight end. He's got that type of ability. So hopefully the Raiders go out there and they use him right. So there you go. Vegas Sports Today was the show. Des Bryant giving some heavy praise there to Brock Bowers. Now, my reason for saying that is because we just talked a moment ago about the fact that, according to Bill Connelly, ESPN, that Georgia actually ranks relatively high in terms of its overall returning production, especially after the transfer portal kind of shakes out. A lot of teams, because here's how you kind of go up on all of this, is as other teams lose more and more players of the transfer portal, they drop down, and therefore those slots allow you to kind of climb up. Plus, based on like the percentages and the ratios, some of this is more than just sort of basic arithmetic. But as other teams lose returning production because those players decide to transfer, Georgia, by holding on to those players, gets a chance to move up. And so Georgia's, sitting kind of pretty on that list here right now. But a guy like Brock Bowers, who Des Bryant calls a Hall of Famer, he does leave, obviously, a big sizable void. And you are left to wonder, okay, well, what next? What after that, given the fact that Georgia may be bringing a decent amount back, but one of the all-time greats in program history, he is moving on. And we said this last week. One of the things that Kirby Smart is talking about that mirrors the overall fan conversation is you got to be ready to mitigate against the loss of a guy like Bowers. And you better be creative in terms of how you try to replace the production a guy like that was responsible for. And because Brock was such a unique player, a tight end who really played more like a wide receiver, we think some of the responsibility for replacing what Bowers brought to the table probably will come from the wide receiver position, or maybe even the running back position, or all kinds of ways in which you can utilize positions other than the one that Bowers played to get the stuff that you want to get for this Georgia offense. However, I think for a couple of seconds here, it is at least interesting to kind of sort of fixate on the tight end position in particular, because while Bowers may be gone, his absence may be felt, what Georgia still has in the tight end room is really pretty impressive. So much so that our friends over at Pro Football Focus, which is not everyone's cup of tea, even Kirby Smart himself, has sort of, I guess, made fun of Pro Football Focus a little bit in the past. But nonetheless, based on their metrics and things like that they use, even in the absence of Brock Bowers, the folks over at Pro Football Focus are still very impressed by the Georgia tight ends overall. Max Chadwick is one of their writers. It was recently put out on social media Chadwick's belief that Oscar Delp and Ben Urasek should form the most formidable tight end duo in the nation. So that's Max Chadwick from Pro Football Focus touting the Georgia tight ends, even without what Des Bryant calls the future Hall of Famer no longer there. Chadwick sort of feels like that the Georgia tight ends will still be the best in the country. Now, a couple of quick things to say about this. The first point is obviously true. When you make a list of the most successful assistant coaches in America, especially those coaching at the kind of the position coach level, it's going to be hard to find anybody who's any better at his job right now than Todd Hartley is. Hartley's well paid, deservedly so. Georgia fans love Hartley. We would say also deservedly so. But sometimes, even if it's an obvious point, it's still worth reiterating again. Todd Hartley's just doing an amazing job as Georgia's tight end coach. The fact that you could lose Bowers and still be this deep at tight end, that just sort of speaks to the job that Hartley's doing, but it also speaks to the job that the Georgia offense is doing in terms of getting these tight ends involved. Because while Hartley does have some influence on that, you got to have Mike Bobo or Todd Monken, prior to that, who are also willing to use the tight ends in a creative way. That's pretty clearly been a big part of what Georgia's doing, which I think, really like. Now, I certainly think that Chadwick, the PFF guy, could end up being right. This could be the best tight end room in America. I still think it's somewhat interesting how exactly Georgia's going to use these tight ends. Like the role that Ben Urasek is going to have here when he gets here from Stanford, I'm still kind of intrigued by this and obviously optimistic about what it can look like. But we talked to Terrence Edwards about this on Thursday. It seems like Georgia was already deep at tight end. I mean, Delp is going to be on the field because he sort of plays what I think of a little bit of a traditional tight end role. He catches the ball, but he's also physical. He can kind of do this, I would think, sort of traditional tight end things. The sort of the hybrid kind of split out version of that seemed like it was going to be Lawson Lucky. That seems like what Jaden Riddell could be too. And yet Georgia also valued the experience that Urasek brings to the table. So overall, I'm assuming that Georgia probably does have the best group of tight ends in America. But specifically how they choose to use these guys, how they divvy up the opportunity to be productive in stats, and who's on the field at a given time, how much of the two tight end stuff do we see, and who those two tight ends are, I still find that to be pretty fascinating and one of those mysteries we'll see solved as we get a little closer to the 2024 season, and certainly once the games themselves start to be played. And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily. Presented by ServPro. I am being told there may be a little bit of breaking news here. So we do have some schedule news coming out here. Connor getting that story up for DawgNation.com. So let me tab dance and give him a chance to do that. We'll talk about this. So yesterday, we're going to talk about more in a moment. Some scheduling news came out. And I guess now we have some scheduling news starting to come out here too as it relates to Georgia. We now know that the season opening game between Georgia and Clemson, I'm being told, will kick off at noon. I don't think there's any way to say this other than that's probably a little bit of a disappointing time. The last few years, when Georgia's played like say Oregon, for instance, in the game in Atlanta, or some of these other games, they've turned out to be just really, really fun, typically very beautiful weather, wonderful tailgate opportunity outside Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and then folks going to go inside for the game there after that. The noon game, I think, is going to take some of that vibe away a little bit, especially for folks who, maybe don't find it as easy to always tailgate in downtown Atlanta anyway. This is going to truly take a little bit more of an NFL vibe here for what is an NFL stadium. So I'm being told that it's breaking. Georgia will play Clemson at noon to kick off the season. Now, if you're watching on TV, I guess it's no different to you one way or another. But for fans who are planning on attending the game, they probably won't celebrate that as great news necessarily, I don't believe. I guess the other point I will add to all of this is that, when you see the success that Fox has had with putting big games at noon, they call this Big Noon Saturday. In fact, we had this down on the rundown for a little bit later on the show, just the fact that we got a big drop of announcements from Fox yesterday about some of the games they're going to be putting on at noon. When you see the success they've had with that, it was just a creative idea that Fox looked at this landscape and said, boy, nobody's putting big games on at noon. Everybody wants their big game at 3:30. That's what CBS always wanted. ESPN sort of pushed for everything to be at night. For whatever reason, the broadcast windows until a couple of years ago had just looked completely different, where there was just sort of a lot of a lot of empty opportunity there at the noon spot. Well, Fox steps in and they say, we're going to put our biggest game there at noon, and we're going to use our pregame show as a lead-in for that. The game's going to kick off right there at noon, and you can check the ratings. We don't necessarily care a ton about TV ratings around here. That's not what we're not necessarily what we're doing. But you can look at the TV ratings. You can see that Fox had great success with it. It's an example of the fact of what we said before. There's no doubt that the Big Ten, we think it's an inferior league to the SEC, but there's no doubt the Big Ten, we think, has gotten a little bit of a boost from its media partners. They've got networks like CBS and NBC, at least involved to a certain extent, a big relationship there with Fox. And when Fox finds the success there with the noon kickoff, that's just an example of the media partner giving the league overall a pretty big boost. And so when you see Fox having that success with that broadcast window, ESPN has to respond to that. They can't just allow, that window to be owned by the Big Ten. So in the last couple of years, we've seen a couple of Georgia games take place at noon that never would have taken place at noon in the past. The Georgia-Arkansas game in 2021 is one that comes to mind, maybe most prominently about this. Big games taking place at noon because Fox was winning that window. People wanted to watch games at noon. Fox was giving a bigger game and getting big TV ratings because of that. So perhaps that's the explanation for why Georgia-Clemson will be the noon start here, just in response to what has been a very successful decision by Fox now as Georgia moves over exclusively to that ESPN family and network. So that's the breaking news that's out here. Georgia-Clemson there at noon to kick off the season. You can read more about that at DawgNation.com. Connor Riley's got the story. And speaking of Connor, he joins us here now on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So there you go, Georgia-Clemson at noon to kick off the season. Connor, I was saying this before, to Georgia fans who are planning on attending this game, I'm guessing this won't be received as great news for fans watching the game on TV. It's probably not too different one way or another. But any immediate reaction to the fact that we do have that game time now for the season opener for Georgia and Clemson?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think as you laid out there, the case of why this is a noon game, one, the fact that Notre Dame is at Texas A&M and ESPN gets a chance to broadcast Notre Dame is a reason that game is the 7:30 kickoff there. The 3:30 kickoff is Miami and Florida. Now, I absolutely believe Georgia-Clemson will be a better game. But, that's a little bit of a rivalry there. It is going to be played in a home-and-home situation, whereas Georgia-Clemson is going to be sort of a neutral site game there. So I get it. I'm sure there are Georgia fans that would have preferred to, spend all day tailgating and whatnot. There are some great breakfast spots in Atlanta that I'm sure you can visit and frequent. So I think there's something to look forward to there. And look, the reality is you just got to wait a little less. You got a shorter wait time now for when Georgia finally takes the field again, which based on Kirby's comments yesterday on the Paul Finebaum show, I think really seemed to indicate that he's ready to go and get ready for this game.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about some of the stuff that Kirby Smart has been saying over the course of the last couple of weeks. I do think it's pretty interesting. I guess let me get one more thing from you on this particular topic before we kind of, move on to some of that kind of stuff. So when CBS had the SEC, we knew their big game was going to always be 3:30. As I mentioned before, Fox has kind of owned that noon window. That's when they've kind of chosen to put their big games. Do we have much insight yet into the strategy for ESPN here? Are they going to put all of their big games on at prime time now that they have so much inventory overall? Are they going to try to spread more of it out? I don't know that I've heard as much from them on this as I would like to. Have they given much of an indication about what their broadcast strategy is going to be to kind of maximize the attention the SEC can get?
Well, I think you look at that September 28th window, Georgia, Alabama, 7:30 ABC. I think that's a pretty clear sign that the marquee game of the week is going to be that primetime window on ABC, something they've had for a long time. And now, because of the new television contract, can finally put SEC teams in that ABC-specific window there. I think what will be interesting to see, and to your point, we don't really know this yet, there are going to be a lot of great games in the SEC week over week. So how does ESPN go about managing that and filling out their schedule? Do they put that sort of number 2 marquee game where Georgia has played in that quite often over the years? Do they put that at, say, the 3:30 window, which I think is going to be a little bit more open now? Now the Big Ten has made it clear they're going to plant their flag on the Fox window. What sort of fills the void at that 3:30 window? Obviously, CBS is still going to have a game, but do you have the number 2, say, Big Ten game, which I believe will air on CBS, go head-to-head against the number 2 SEC game, which will air on ESPN. We don't yet know how that's going to turn out. They could also put the number 2 ESPN game at 7 p.m. They could also try to counter-program the Big Ten. at noon. So, I think we know that the biggest game is going to be in that 7:30 window. But on a week-by-week basis, where you aren't the biggest game every week, it'll be interesting to see how they go about filling that out.
Before you joined the show, I was talking about Georgia and its tight ends, and Des Bryant showing all kinds of love to Brock Bowers, and then what Georgia has left behind there with Oscar Delp and Ben Urasek coming in, and what Pro Football Focus said about that tandem in particular. I mean, I agree that it seems like Georgia probably still has the best tight ends in America, and I believe that Todd Hartley deserves a lot of credit for that. But as I talked to Terrence Edwards about last Thursday, I'm still not 100% sure exactly how Georgia's going to use all of these guys. I think that Ben Urasek is certainly a productive player, and it's probably really good to have him on the roster in terms of what his role is going to be and what that means for a guy like Lawson Lucky that seems like he's probably about ready to want to play too. And a guy like Jaden Riddell, even as a freshman, who's certainly potentially good enough to make a contribution there too. I think sifting through and kind of figuring out how frequently does Georgia have two tight ends on the field, who those tight ends will be, and if it is the veteran Urasek with the veteran Delp, what does that mean for the younger Georgia tight ends? I'm kind of fascinated by that topic at the moment.
Yeah, it's important to note on the first play of the spring game, Georgia came out in a two tight end set with Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky there. Now, Ben Urasek was not with the team this spring. He's set to arrive later this summer after graduating from Stanford. And to your larger point, like the tight end room is just going to have to look different this year. Oscar Delp is Oscar Delp, and he is not Brock Bowers. And I actually think he's done a great job of accepting that, and Georgia's done a good job of messaging that. And Oscar is a great tight end in his own right. He's just a little bit of a different one. I think he's a better inline blocker in that regard. Not that Brock is a bad one, obviously, but I think that is a strength that plays more into Oscar's size there. I think he's maybe more of a traditional tight end in that usage there. Whereas I think it's not a slam dunk guarantee in my mind that Ben Urasek comes in and is that number two tight end. I know they think very highly of Lawson Lucky. Obviously had the great spring last year before being slowed by an ankle injury in August. And he's got a leg up on Urasek in this Georgia system. And look, if Lawson Lucky is just a better player than Ben Urasek, Lawson Lucky is going to play more. We've seen not every transfer comes in here and makes a huge impact. So I think one of the sneaky big position battles that I'm sort of looking forward to is how that Lawson Lucky Ben Urasek battle plays out, because obviously Urasek comes from a Stanford program where traditionally they had used a lot of tight ends there. And if he's able to stay healthy, I'm not saying he is Brock Bowers, but he can do things similar there. And so I think how Lucky and Urasek compete in the month of August is going to be really, really interesting. I don't think that they're going to use 52% of their sets in two tight end sets like they did in 2022 when they had Brock and Darnell Washington. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they do it a little bit more this coming year, just because I think they're a deeper tight end room with Urasek, with Delp, with Lucky there in terms of experience and what those guys have done. So I think maybe a little bit of an in-between with what we saw in recent years from Georgia in terms of the two tight end usage. But I think these guys are still going to be a factor in this offense, even with the Georgia wide receiver room, I think in everyone's mind, being in a better spot as it stands right now.
So if you go back to 2020, which was the last year for Georgia prior to Brock Bowers' arrival, and you measure it on the basis of receiving yards per game, Darnell Washington cracked the top 5 that year. Do you think a tight end is one of Georgia's 5 most productive pass catchers here this year?
I would say, yeah. I think, you're probably going to have 3 wide receivers there. I would think Dominic Lovett, WR Thomas, and Dylan Bell are your top 3. Maybe a Trevor Etienne sneaks his way in there, but I think you've seen already Carson Beck in key situations last year look for Oscar Delp. He had that big touchdown in the Missouri game there. And so if I'm betting right now, I think both the upside potential of a Urasek or the steadiness that Oscar Delp brings, knowing that he's going to be on the field pretty much every play, I think that gives the opportunity there for someone to crack the top 5.
All right, so you kind of touched on this a moment ago. We've talked a lot about this the last few days. We heard a decent amount from Kirby last week at the Celebrity Golf Tournament there in Birmingham, both in terms of the JOX interview that he did, the Finebaum interview that aired yesterday. And to me, Connor, I guess if you want to make a sort of a thematic takeaway from this, there are some topics that right now I think that Kirby's pretty eager to talk about, and a couple that he's not all that interested in terms of like actual game planning stuff or personnel on the field. Kirby, for the most part, sort of sidestepped those questions. But in the clip that we played for you a little earlier from the Finebaum show yesterday, very eager to talk about the challenging nature of the 2024 schedule and being ready for that. And frankly, also seemingly pretty, energized by what Georgia was able to do in keeping players in the program and not being decimated by this spring transfer portal window. it seems like in both those cases, Kirby was willing to give more than was asked in terms of those particular topics. Sounds like he's pretty excited about those things right now.
Yeah, I think the most interesting comment that Kirby has given of late, and I've got the quote pulled up here, so I'll read it. I'm excited to get an opportunity to go out there and play. I'm so tired of the talk about the NIL and the talk about the portal and all the complaining. Let's go play football. Let's get our team against their team and see where we stand.
Yeah.
Let's go play. I think he is tired of being asked to fix college football, something he recognizes he cannot do. I think he's ready to move past the transfer portal, and I think the fact that Georgia, certainly in comparison to some of the other SEC teams at the top of this league, Ole Miss, Alabama, and Texas, with how inactive Georgia was in the transfer portal, both in terms of players leaving, but also bringing players in. Like, he's been past that point, and he's ready to go out there and play a game this week. And so obviously he's got a long time to go and a long time to wait. But I think he also knows that, these next 2-3 months, there's going to be a lot of talk about the transfer portal, about NIL, about all these things that aren't really germane to the game of football itself. And I think this is where Kirby is in lockstep with a lot of fans. Like, at a certain point, we've reached an overload with these subjects where certainly we in the media engage in this, talk too much about it, and it is now taking away from the active, participation in the game of football and the discussion of it there. And I think he's ready to move past that. And while that's not going to stop the questions from coming, I think it recognizes where his head is at this point, and he has moved past this sort of offseason leader, I am the best coach in college football, unless these are my opinions on this matter. Like, he doesn't care about any of that stuff. He wants to go out there, get on the practice field, start getting ready for Clemson on August 31st, and go out there and have his football team ready to go. And I hope that maybe we, in the media sense, get to a point where we are starting to get closer to that as we make our way through this offseason.
So let me tell you what my response is to that. And in hearing Kirby say what you just read from him, here's my thought. As a Georgia fan, Kirby Smart's focus on his team and the games that are about to be played are exactly where I think they should be. I mean, after all, he is paid to win games, and saying, whatever the system is, I want to utilize the system here in the prime of my career to be as successful as I possibly can. Well, that's exactly where I think Georgia fans want his focus to be, and that's exactly where it appears that Kirby Smart's focus is. However, separate from that, I think a lot of us also look at this college football landscape as a system that needs some help right now, and it needs someone to provide some leadership about a better path forward. And if the best coach in college football doesn't want to do that, which in the case of Kirby Smart, he's well within his rights to, and when Nick Saban was still employed, he was sort of the same type of way. He was more interested in leveraging the system for his benefit than he was shaping the system for the future. If these guys don't want to do that, which probably they are better served by focusing on the duty that lies nearest, which is, leading their teams, then who's that leader going to be? Because, Kirby's kind of the college football version of sort of an establishment candidate right now. Like the system is what it is, and he's just going to use it to his benefit, which is what Georgia fans, I believe, should want him to do. But, man, where's the leadership going to come from? Because I think a lot of coaches are focused on whatever the system is. We just got to find a way to keep on winning. But that sort of leaves the store unmanned if you're not careful.
So, and I understand the point you're making, and I think it's just a larger seismic issue within college football is that there has been no leadership for such a long time. And I think part of this is, so many people are acting out of their own best self-interest. And while I believe Kirby Smart wants what's good for college football as a whole, not every coach does. And so Kirby is sort of, I believe, forced to play by that way of, okay, like, I'm content to make sacrifices, but if no one else is, then I'm going to go ahead and get mine in that regard there as well. Look, the reality is, I don't know how much Kirby Smart can actually do in terms of providing leadership for the sport, because he does have such a vested interest in the success of the Georgia football program. And there are just naturally going to be people that are skeptical of his ideals and his benefits there that come from this. So I'm always sort of dubious of the fact that a college coach in particular is going to be able to come in and clean up what needs to be done so in college football. At the same point in time, no one in the NCAA has ever shown any interest in being a leader of any kind whatsoever. And quite frankly, and look, I think you and I share this opinion, I'm very skeptical of Greg Sankey as this leader type figure. I don't love the direction that the SEC has trended in recent years. And so, if it's not him and it's not, the name escapes me of the Big Ten commissioner at this point in time, if it's not those guys, who is it? Is it a TV executive that's going to come in and wrangle everything up? Clearly, Congress is not going to clean this up, and I don't believe Congress should be involved in terms of cleaning this up. So that's, I think, a larger issue in college football as a whole. But whether it was a new coach that Georgia had, let's say, God willing, this doesn't happen, Kirby Smart elects to retire tomorrow, like whoever that new Georgia coach is isn't going to be able to come in and fix this problem, even if that is something that he very clearly wants to do. So I understand Kirby taking the approach that he has. And the reality is, and unfortunately, this may be a bit nihilist, like college football is what it is at this point. And so I think, as Kirby mentioned yesterday, you have to choose to find the joy in things. Otherwise, your career in this is just going to be a lot shorter.
No, I thought that was really a strong statement that he made there as well. Totally agree. Just change the subject here for a moment. Four-star wide receiver Thomas Blackshear has committed to Georgia. And what I said about this yesterday, Connor, is obviously it remains to be seen how good of a player he's going to be. But the one prediction I believe I can make with accuracy is that he will be rated higher at the end of this recruiting cycle than he is right now, because that's what happens to receivers that Georgia targets. The energy will always exist around the topic of Georgia and wide receivers and what Georgia does with them, and does Georgia get enough credit for what it does with them? That's always going to happen. But I do firmly believe there's not a program either that scouts receivers better than Georgia does. So however good Blackshear ends up being, much like Nitro Tuggle a year ago, his recruiting profile will rise. Georgia will have, as the gamblers like to say, closing line value here in terms of where this is going after this, because that's just sort of what happens to receivers that Georgia target. And I expect the same thing to happen with Blackshear as well, whether he stays in the class or not, whether he goes on to start him in college or not. He will eventually be viewed in a higher sphere than he currently is now.
Yeah, and I think with Blackshear, Ryan reminds me a little bit of Kearis Jackson, former Georgia receiver there. Obviously, I think Blackshear is a little bit bigger. But I think first commitment of the James Coley era in his second stint at Georgia. And he really, I think, has a chance to make a statement in this wide receiver room this year, in part because of the talent that is in the state of Georgia in this class. Blackshear, I think, was one of the guys they had to land. I think when you look at C.J. Wiley out of Milton, and then you look at Travis Smith Jr. out of Westlake here, I think if you're able to land all three of those guys, and look, I've been very critical of the way Georgia goes about building its wide receiver room. I don't think that they want to be in a spot where over a 2-year period, they're taking 5 transfer wide receivers every year. The fact that they need to go out there and get their guys, and they land one in an in-state prospect in Thomas Blackshear, who, as I agree with you, probably going to see his recruiting ranking rise up, especially as he continues to grow as a player there. I think that this is a good first step for James Coley, but, and I touched on this in my piece on Monday, with what they have exiting the program after this season at the wide receiver position, he's going to need to sign a really good high school wide receiver recruiting class. While also knowing he's probably going to have to recruit out of the portal again, just given the turnover that we can expect to see in this Georgia wide receiver room after the 2024 season.
And what we've said a lot here is the timing seems to be good, if that is in case the truth, that Georgia needs to supplement with high school receivers here right now. Then what a great time to have such a deep crop in state. Seems like Georgia's got, strong relationships with guys like Wiley and Smith, and having that kind of talent in state for Georgia appears to be coming at the right time.
Right. And I think that's just sort of the thing with the wide receiver recruiting for Georgia is, unlike, say defensive line or inside linebacker, I don't think Georgia's in a spot where they're going to be able to win national recruitments of wide receivers at this point in time, just given the way the position has been used in recent years and how it is seen from a high school recruiting spot. And again, NIL just plays a larger factor, I think, in wide receiver recruitments than it does other places. And so Georgia has shown that they're willing to spend that NIL money elsewhere. So to your point, they need to do a great job of scouting wide receivers, and they've done that. I think they've consistently found good players. I think Anthony Evans is another example out of Texas where they're flipping him late from Oklahoma, and I think he certainly looks like a promising young player for Georgia. So, again, they're going to have to win in-state wide receivers when they're available. I think in this class they have 3 really great ones in this state, and I would count Blackshear among one of those, even if he is, as of right now, maybe a little bit under the radar in terms of the way he is viewed as a recruit.
Connor, good stuff. Responding to some quick breaking news here today involving the Georgia-Clemson game time, reacting to the stuff that Kirby Smart has said over the course of the last few days, and looking ahead to what's about to be a really busy and I think really fascinating time coming up this summer for Georgia recruiting. We appreciate your time here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro, and we will look forward to getting the chance to speak to you again soon.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, really interesting. And, I do like this part of the recruiting calendar. I think a lot of you know that I don't love the early signing period in December. I think that's just a really weird time to have it crammed in with everything else. But I do love the action in the summer. I think June's a really good time for a lot of this. And people are kind of in a summer mode, so they're not experiencing all of it in the moment always, but there is a lot happening. It leads to a lot of July commitments and things like that. I think that kind of comes at a fun time prior to these players beginning their senior seasons in many cases. The college teams kind of beginning their preparation for the upcoming fall. I do love this part of the recruiting calendar. I think a lot of this happens at kind of the right time. And so I think that is really fun. Now, here's what else is fun. Cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and the excitement that's out there about Utopia of the Seas here right now. Continuing to hear a lot of chatter about that. People who want their own experience on the brand new Oasis class ship. And what's going to be really fun here is, in some cases, I'm even seeing some great savings opportunities out there for that here right now. So if you've never taken a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation before, let me try to explain to you why I think Utopia of the Seas would be a good choice for your first. First of all, it sails out of Port Canaveral. Now, that may not mean a ton to you, but you got to understand, I live here in the Atlanta area, so Port Canaveral is essentially the closest port to where I live that, ships like this sail out of. So, it's a really convenient drive. It's not a hard drive at all. Just past Orlando, you're right there at Port Canaveral, and so you can kind of settle in there for that. You can do the 3-night cruise, the long weekend, or the 4-night cruise. And that's really cool here, the fact that a brand new Oasis class ship is being utilized for these short cruises, which are a very popular cruise option, especially out of Port Canaveral. And you can take advantage of the best that Royal Caribbean has to offer on its newest ship of all. We talked a lot about Icon of the Seas, and that's still really exciting. But the newest of the ships is Utopia of the Seas. And it's got so many cool things, like you just saw in video, the view bar. You like rooftop bars. How about a rooftop bar that looks out over the ocean, looks out over the expanse of the Caribbean? Or the Mason Jar, the Southern-themed restaurant with the live country music band that plays, the bourbon cocktails, the Southern-style food. So many fun things to enjoy on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. Jessica Slater can help you out with your next Royal Caribbean cruise vacation or your first Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, so let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here for a moment. A name that many SEC fans will remember, apparently on the move again. Agiye Hall began his career at Alabama, sort of had, I think, a little bit of a hard time fitting in there, to be honest with you. Moves on to Texas. He had some brushes with some off-field issues there, and now he's on the move again. And he's going to UCF. Now, one of the issues here is, I talked to you yesterday about Julian Humphrey leaving Colorado and going to Florida and perhaps doing so as a walk-on. I guess there is some chatter coming out of Orlando that Agiye Hall may also be a walk-on at UCF. I want you to put a pin on that. We're going to come back to that part of this story in a couple of minutes. But I also kind of want to point out here that I don't care what kind of baggage, both in some cases on the field and off the field, that Hall may be dealing with. Getting him at a place like UCF is probably a value add overall. And if it doesn't work out, they'll have the chance to move on from them. But there is clearly some talent to be had here for a player good enough to draw the interest of both Alabama and Texas, and now Gus Malzahn gets him at UCF, which is why when you see Gus Malzahn, if you do, they'll have Big 12 Media Days coming up in the summer or these times, Gus Malzahn looks happier than I've ever seen him. He looks more relaxed than I've ever seen him. He has clearly found a way at UCF to get some SEC-level talent to a non-SEC team. KJ Jefferson, quarterback, for instance. We can cite other names here, too. No one's recruiting talent in the new Big 12 better than Malzahn is there for UCF. This matters from an SEC standpoint because UCF is competing with the likes of Florida for talent, and they're also competing with the Gators on the field this fall there as well. So does Hall light the world on fire at UCF? Does he even play there? Obviously, a lot of that's to be determined just given the somewhat, checkered nature of Hall's past. But it's a pretty big-time talent ad for a team that's slowly but surely kind of adding some names like this, a la KJ Jefferson, and making themselves, I would say, pretty dangerous in the process. So we mentioned a little earlier, we find out that Georgia Clemson is going to kick off the season at noon. Probably not viewed as good news necessarily for every Georgia fan. because that's not really the tradition that Georgia fans enjoy. In the Big Ten, though, the early starts are a little bit more of their natural tradition. Watch why it was such an easy tie when Fox, who televised a lot of these Big Ten games, was doing their big noon Saturday. Well, yesterday they announced a few of these games. I think it's interesting that we, of course, know that Michigan-Ohio State's going to be a noon game on November 30th. That has been seemingly every year. But in addition to that, you've got Texas at Michigan on September 7th, which happens to be my wife's birthday, and September 14th, Alabama at Wisconsin. Now, here is what I couldn't help but notice about this. So this is the big marquee time slot for the Big Ten, the big offseason announcement about 3 of our big noon Saturdays for the upcoming season. And of those 3 games that are announced, 2 of them, Texas at Michigan, Alabama at Wisconsin, involve SEC teams. And I'm telling you right now, I hope this is not true, but I just sort of wonder, how long is the ESPN family of networks that have exclusive rights to broadcast SEC games, how many years in the future are they going to be okay with Fox touting an ESPN media product, in this case both Texas and Alabama, on their own network? Like, it's just sort of assumed this kind of cooperation among networks with their rights holder partners is going to continue because that's the way the college football has always been. But I sort of wonder, does that continue in perpetuity where we see, because we don't see this in like boxing. Remember the old days of like, well, so-and-so is a Showtime fighter. You can only watch him on Showtime. And so-and-so is an HBO fighter. You can only watch him on HBO. And if you have the HBO contract, you don't fight a Showtime fighter. And, there's been, a lot of that. Professional wrestling's got even more of that, obviously. I hope that college football doesn't go in that direction. But you can't help but wonder when you see all the change that is taking place. And speaking of that, one final thing to give you here. So there was a really interesting write-up at ESPN.com about a possible settlement coming in the House versus NCAA case. This is, of all the lawsuits that are out there, I think this is sort of being treated as the biggest because the potential payout from the settlement is going to be so much larger, where we're talking about billions. In some cases, it's back pay going to previous college athletes, obviously setting up a revenue-sharing structure for the future. And, I've said this over and over again, that I hesitate to talk about some of this kind of stuff because I feel like you can't really talk about it without kind of getting out of the boundaries of what we typically discuss. Connor mentioned this with Kirby Smart a little earlier. Kirby's like, hey, man, let's just go play the games. And I think that our conversation is always the kind of thing that everybody sort of feels like they can play along with when we're talking about what's going to happen between the lines and the games themselves. But if we're going to really have the accurate conversation about what's happening with our sport, then occasionally addressing some of this other kind of stuff, I think you have to at least do it a little bit. And, to be honest with you, I think if you're going to do that, then you have to be willing to say some of the things that I guess, are not typically a part of the overall normal conversation. For instance, one of the things I find to be interesting about the potential settlement in this House versus NCAA case is the fact that some conferences and some teams within those conferences are a little more excited about doing this than others are. Apparently, the Big Ten is all in on the big settlement here. Now, can't help but remember that back in 2020, they were also the league that was all in on canceling the season. And frankly, college football had to be saved that year, basically in opposition to what the Big Ten wanted. And so now, here these few years later, the fact that the Big Ten is all in on this, I guess, inclined to be skeptical of what the Big Ten wants because I saw what the Big Ten wanted in 2020. That makes me a little bit skeptical. The other thing here is that, some of the need to settle this and the money associated with that is one of the things that's perhaps kind of driving the potential rift in the ACC, where there are some college programs that when they look at the size of the potential payout they'll be responsible for on the settlement, they're just wondering if they can be able to do it, which sort of takes you back to something I told you last week. The biggest complaint I have about the direction that college football seems to be going, that over the course of the long haul, all of this change is supposedly about benefiting players. But if we end up with fewer teams and if we end up with fewer players on those teams, is that really benefiting the average player? I think that's a question that shouldn't be rhetorical. I think it ought to be asked and it ought to be answered. And when you see even now the financial rift that's sort of driving some teams out of the ACC and some teams into obscurity, once again, it sort of speaks to eventually the sum total of teams playing major college football right now, eventually that number is going to probably get smaller. It just is. And we already know on the basis of this settlement that what has been allowed for like preferred walk-ons, things like that, that's probably going away there as well, which once again sort of brings to mind potentially fewer teams, potentially fewer players. And the question that needs to be asked of, well, how does that benefit the average player if that's the case? But then there's also this, and y'all, this is not going to be popular, but I do feel like this has to be asked. Like right now, we're questioning everything, it seems like, but yet still there are a couple of topics that don't seem to come up in this at all. For instance, I mentioned a moment ago, Agiye Hall potentially walking on at UCF, or Julian Humphrey potentially walking on at Florida. And their college, I guess, is going to be paid by an NIL deal. Are we going to get to a point, and perhaps we should, are we going to get to a point where guys like Humphrey and Hall or whoever else, not Humphrey, whatever, where guys like this then challenge the system and say, how come you're taking the NIL money that I could get? How come you're giving it to the school? Like, why do I have to be a student? Why does my academic status prevent my ability to earn income? Why can't I just challenge that? I mean, I think there are questions like that need to be asked here. And then if you read the ESPN story, there's also the thing of, they don't know quite yet if there is a revenue sharing deal put in place of, well, how is this going to be worked out with Title IX? Do the football players get more, or do all the athletes, revenue sports, non-revenue sports, do they all get treated equally? And that's sort of treated as a small detail to be figured out later on. But if you're a football player, and many football players watch the show and listen to the show, if you're a football player, are you okay with the revenue that you earn through your risk of injury, through your hard work, going to some athlete in some other sport that you've never met, that the platform that they use in some cases becomes, an opportunity to create NIL opportunities for themselves, but they're playing a sport that you essentially paid for? Are you okay with that part of this? I think those are questions that ought to be asked here, and maybe in the future they will, but it's important to point out they are not being asked right now. And we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we wrap up here today, let me also give a shout out to our friends at Mr. Rooter, doing great work for folks in our audience when it comes to all kinds of plumbing issues, including whole home water filtration, drain cleaning and repair, water heaters, and so much more. They're dedicated to addressing your plumbing needs as quickly as possible, because that's what Mr. Rooter is all about, whether it's residential, commercial, or anything else in between. You can count on them for upfront pricing, flexible service options, and exceptional customer service. Plus, there's a $29 service fee that's waived anytime you get some repair work done. So I want you to find out more. It's MrRooterGeorgia.com to find your local Mr. Rooter. One more time, MrRooterGeorgia.com for more details on all of that. It's a really fun time of year because so many milestones being celebrated here right now, including a lot of graduations, including a lot of college graduations, including a lot of folks graduating from the University of Georgia. What a proud moment that is for those who get a chance to do that. In fact, we will celebrate one of those here today. So Josh Stevens checks in. Great photo of him underneath the arch now as a Georgia graduate. He writes in to say, the big dog, I'm a real dog now. And he says, this is golden shoe worthy. You better believe that it is, Josh. Congratulations on your graduation. And to all of those graduating from UGA or wherever you're graduating from, what a tremendous accomplishment and what a special moment, including Josh right there sharing a pretty cool photo of himself celebrating his degree from the University of Georgia. Lousy stinking Gators, well, they don't have much to celebrate here right now. It's been a long time since they've beaten Georgia, a number that we're going to watch climb up a lot in the days to come. About 1,284 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gatorade Updater. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews is the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can check them out on all of that today. So we'll find out what's on your mind here and see where you want to take the discussion. I'm going to start on YouTube first here. We'll kind of roll through everything else after that. Alan Hampton checks in. He says we should forget buying high-dollar prima donna wide receivers, invest that money in the trenches, offense and defense. I mean, if you want to – I mean, look, nobody denies the value of wide receivers, but when you look at the NFL draft, for instance, of the wide receivers, like the first couple of rounds, like an inordinate amount were wide receivers. In other words, receivers are valuable, but they're not particularly scarce. whereas elite offensive and defensive linemen are just a lot more scarce. And, your college coaches will tell you that NFL coaches are telling them, oh, man, we're not seeing offensive and defensive linemen being developed, which is the kind of thing that's been said now for 100 years, I guess, in football. But it does speak to the scarcity that you can go to any college and find a receiver who has a chance to play in the NFL. But you can't go just anywhere and find a defensive lineman or an elite offensive lineman. So, therefore, value is, I believe, always determined by scarcity. I'm talking about real value. There's perceived value all the time in things that aren't particularly scarce. But when you have perceived value around a non-scarce good, eventually that value craters. And, when it comes to offensive and defensive linemen in football, that is actual value. There is actual scarcity there. And so I do believe that how you choose to allocate your NIL funds is going to be important. And putting more of that along the offensive and defensive lines, I do believe is going to be really important there as well. Howard Eubanks says, I wonder who the head coach for Florida is going to be by the cocktail party. I think that there is a very good chance that Billy Napier does not coach in that game. And if you're making, like predictions of the upcoming season, predicting Napier not to make it that far, and that the team would kind of utilize a different coach through that very tough stretch in November, that is certainly a possibility, especially given the fact that the overall signing class this year, the early signing period, moves up even sooner, which means that the sort of unintended consequence to that is the coaching carousel could also spin a little sooner there as well. Mike wondering about the, all tailgate and things like that. That'll all still go on as normal. Just the hours of it will be a little bit different. But all the plans, at least to my knowledge, should all be the same there on that. Randy Payne is not excited, though, for that noon kick for Georgia Clemson. I think a lot of Georgia fans will probably feel the same way. By the way, Nature Gator's back home again and back with us again. I know he's been dealing with some health stuff. So, Nature, we're glad that you're here. Appreciate that. Spencer Clark, happy about Dejon Edwards doing well during the Pittsburgh Steelers rookie minicamp, the same way that Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint was for the Commanders. Yeah, you love to see stuff like that. That's great. Senio G says, I'm confused about how Billy Napier still has a job when Auburn got rid of Brian Harsin so quick after hiring him. I think you have two very different scenarios here. In the case of Harsin, the key boosters didn't want him to begin with. And so, they kind of got their way on this because, eventually, there was nothing on the field that could support him keeping his job. And so, therefore, the people who didn't want him hired to begin with, they wanted, believe it or not, Kevin Steele to be head coach. They eventually sort of got their way. At Florida, there is a lot more of a built-in desire for Napier to succeed because, as we pointed out, in the case of Scott Strickland, I don't know that you get a chance to hire a third football coach if this doesn't quite work out. And so, I think that Strickland's going to give Napier every chance to succeed because Napier's perceived success, I do believe, kind of goes to the overall perception of Strickland too. Foster Moss says, can you see UCF in the 12-team playoff? I mean, I sort of reckon just about anybody could win the Big 12. I guess Utah's probably the favorite in the new Big 12, which is still hard to get used to. But, I mean, I could see anybody winning that league. I could. Nature Gator says Florida's roster is rated number 12th best in the country for 24 by Athlon. And before Grimsley and Zandamela, it says UCS 54 before adding a troubled wide receiver. Yeah, listen, I mean, and obviously, Nature, we're glad to have you back here. It sounds like you're thinking that Florida should win that game. I guess they probably should. So let's see if they do. But what you're saying about the measurable roster talent of the two schools, I don't think will be reflected in the point spread. But maybe I'll end up being wrong. We'll see. Let's see what else. Let me scroll back up here and YouTube it a little bit. JC says it's amazing how fast an hour goes here on this show. JC, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. Maybe that's because you're enjoying each other, but hopefully you're enjoying some of me there too. Howard Eubanks also on the subject of he He says opening up the playbook for Carson Beck's going to get great offensive results too. Perhaps it does. Randy Hall gives Connor a nice compliment. You'd love to see that. PDT says if Billy Napier's not the coach, I believe they will definitely have a high-profile coach with an established background of wanting to turn the program around. Yeah, oftentimes coaching hires are a little bit like presidential elections in that sometimes the new person is the response to the old person. And you can go back through history, see examples of that about different personality types that have been, our presidents, whether, politically you agree with them or not. Sometimes coaching kind of works the same way where, Napier was the up-and-coming group of 5 coach, and so therefore the next coach needs to be something different. The established Power 5 coach, that's probably what Florida should have done to begin with. That's kind of always my point, is that at a precarious time for your program, betting on a group of 5 coach was a risky bet, especially given the fact that he was right there in LSU's backyard. LSU needed a coach, and they weren't interested in Billy Napier. Now, some of that can be ego of where LSU, we can't hire the Lafayette coach. Sometimes that can be the case, or sometimes it can be, something a little bit different. But either way, after Napier had failed, after Mullen had failed as a replacement for McElwain, who had failed, as a replacement for Will Muschamp, who had some challenges there too, to think, okay, well, now we're going to roll the dice on a group of 5 coach. And this to me is a little bit like scouting quarterbacks or anything like that. Of course, Napier had a good resume. If he didn't have a good resume, he couldn't get the job. Every coach who gets hired in an SEC power like this, of course they've got a good resume. Of course they do. They wouldn't be a candidate for the job if they didn't. But even in the category of young, up-and-coming coaches who all have good resumes, even in the category of that, determining who's going to end up being the real rising star head coach and who's going to end up sort of flopping and flailing, nobody knows. These kinds of personnel choices are still, kind of contained, deep within a lockbox. Nobody really knows this. But when you spend big on the proven commodity, at least you have some idea of what you're getting. And if Napier does fail, eventually that's probably what Florida will do. Roger Hall says maybe they should just bring back Steve Spurrier. I don't know. Maybe that's the case. Or also said, how about bringing back Urban Meyer as well, which is kind of funny to think about. DT says, where is the academic pursuit now? I obviously love college football, or I wouldn't be here every day, yet college football has become the NFL minor league more than a sport for student athletes. So here is kind of the point I would say to that, is that, DT, I want desperately to try to preserve some element of the system that we've enjoyed that has been a pillar in American life for more than a century. I'm not trying to be blowhardy, but that just is true. College football has been, I think it's, just behind the NFL, it's the second most popular sport in America now. There were lots of times in our kind of, early 20th century, college football is more popular than the NFL. College football has been a pillar in American life for a long, long time, and I want to preserve that. And let me tell you what's not working. I'm just being frank right now. Let me tell you what's not working. This thing where you look at the radical elements within the legal framework or the, sort of advocacy framework or whatever else, the radical elements that are pushing college football to become something unrecognizable. Those who are desirous of seeing this happen, they're pushing this direction. Those of us who are saying, maybe we ought to slow down a little bit. Those of us who are saying maybe we ought to slow down, that argument's not working. That argument is not working. The people who want to change and change fast are not being deterred by traditionalists who are saying maybe we ought to slow down. So if you have a desired outcome and your current course of action isn't working, or if you have a hoped result from a debate and your current debate tactic isn't working, then it only makes sense you try something new. So what I was alluding to a little earlier in the show is this. Maybe it's time to suggest some new tactics, and maybe it's time to argue some new points. In other words, instead of saying to all those, lawyers and judges and whatever, that are trying to sort of push this to become something very, very new, very, very fast, Instead of saying, hey, let's be careful and slow down, what if we said, okay, let's go even faster than you want to? So you want to make these guys employees and you want to do this. How about we say they don't have to be students anymore? How about we say that giving money they earn to a school that oftentimes is not training them very well for life, and you can look at the news reports and sort of see, what's happening on college campuses for more information on that. Maybe the money the player earns shouldn't have to be paid to a school in exchange for, some course study that's, perhaps not what it's cracked up to be. Maybe the players should get a right to have that money themselves because college tuition is expensive. And when you go play college football, you may be on scholarship, but you're not going to school for free. Someone is paying for it for you. The school is raking that money in. Maybe we should challenge that part of the system. I think we probably should. Or when you think about athletes' collective bargaining, college football players would be fools to collective bargain alongside other athletes in other sports that don't generate a fraction of the revenue that college football generates. But right now, that's what they want. College football players should challenge that. So the same way that right now the system's being challenged, I think every aspect of the system should be challenged. Those of us who said, hey, maybe slow down, that argument's not working. Now let's say, let's speed up. Let's not only challenge this, let's challenge the idea that you have to be a student. Let's challenge the idea that the money that you make ought to go fund a different sport, other athletes on campus. Like, why is that fair? Shouldn't that be challenged? I think it probably should. And maybe then the terms of the debate would perhaps change. For instance, and listen, everybody loves Caitlin Clark, and I love Caitlin Clark too, I guess. But, she is making millions of dollars off her name, image, and likeness. But the platform that made her famous was paid for by football players. Now, legally, that's the framework that's in place. But is that fair from everybody's perspective? If you were a football player and you were watching her become a multimillionaire and the plane that she flew on was paid for by your sweat and the gym that she played in was, operated, funding by your hard work, your risk of injury, would you be happy about that? Same thing for like Livy Dunn or any of these other athletes. They've done a great job of cultivating their own personal brands, but the platform that gave them their fame was paid for by football players. Maybe that part of this ought to be challenged as well. It's at least worth considering. Rambo looking ahead to the baseball this week, saying, let's win that series against the lousy stinking Gators. Enter the SEC tournament with momentum. Who predicted a top 10 ranking for this team this year in Wes Johnson's first year? Yeah, right now Wes Johnson looks like a real find as Georgia baseball coach. And obviously Josh Brooks is in the midst of, he's had to make some coaching changes here as of late. And that's never an easy thing to do. And I guess some of these hires and the success of them will be determined. But right now, things look really good for Wes Johnson. They do. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment. See what folks have on their mind on there. Then we have to wrap up a little bit after that. So a little bit of Facebook, one more trip around the other comment sections, and we'll be gone after that. Sorry, y'all. Facebook always takes forever to load. Nor sometimes it just doesn't load at all. All right, let me come back to Facebook here in a moment. I'll try it on my phone, too, if it doesn't load on my laptop. Paul Moon says if college football money didn't spill over to other sports, those other sports couldn't support themselves and wouldn't exist. And I don't want that to change, Paul. I like the system the way that it is. To me, this is a little bit like, people wanted to break up the cable bundle, and then they broke up the cable bundle, and they realized, oh, gosh, this is a mess, and now they're trying to put the cable bundle back together. You may have seen this with, like, Hulu and Disney Plus and Max. They're all kind of combining together for an option that some things, when you break them apart, they're not easily put back together. And there are a lot of people right now that want to break up like a small part of the college athletic system. We're just going to break this part over here. But the same people who never account for unintended consequences seem to not be accounting for the unintended consequences in this too, because complex systems can't be easily manipulated without creating all kinds of stuff that you didn't consider. So I don't want non-revenue sports to go away. But if the only way to get people to see just how dangerous it is to tinker with a pillar of American life like college athletics, then I say don't just tear part of it down, tear the whole thing down. Because at that point in time, you'll sort of see how much the structure sort of, that has stood the test of time, how much that structure, has kind of made sense. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron wonders who gets back into coaching first, Ed Orgeron or Urban Meyer. Yeah, I wonder about that just simply from the standpoint that some of the stuff that Urban Meyer said recently about NIL being cheating and things like that, like we're, for the most part, traditionalists in terms of preserving the system, but we're not anti-NIL. And, the idea that NIL represents some sort of form of cheating, I think that would sort of lead you to believe that Meyer might not be set up to coach very well in this modern time, very easily perhaps. And that, for a long time, anytime a program had a coaching opening, that was like the first name you'd always hear as like the sort of swing for the fences type hire. You don't really hear that as much anymore. I would definitely say that his time as Jacksonville Jaguars coach and some of the things that have happened since then have definitely, I think, caused an erosion of his reputation. I don't think that Urban Meyer is viewed as the same kind of coach he once was. Joseph Kennedy says it's cool today. Yeah, you don't quite have summertime weather here right now. Gerald Harmon, thanks for being here. Matt Rugavine would like to see either Meyer or Spurrier back at Florida so Kirby can beat him down. That's pretty funny. Winfred Steinspring says Saban will not coach again. So let's just put a pin in this for right now. You know how we do like bold predictions and things like that? Like, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm not. But it would not surprise me at some point in time within the next 2 years, we at least get a Saban coaching rumor. Because Saban is, to my understanding, healthy. And he's going to be active. He's going to be working on ESPN each and every week. I think we at least get a Saban coaching rumor at some point in time within the next 2 years. Now, who is that coaching? I don't know. Probably not Alabama, unless it goes really, really bad for DeBoer. But put a pin in this. Let's come back on this 2 summers from now. I bet within the next 2 years we'll get a Saban coaching rumor. I bet we will. And it may be I'm more than just, crackpot type thing. Let's see what else going on. Barry Watkins, he already started the Saban coaching rumor, so there you go. So I say my prediction's already proven true. My prediction has already proven true. Philip Jordan Wells says Orgeron gets paid to sit on a beach trying to. I can't read all that, but Orgeron seems to be living life and loving life. He won a national championship. He coached one of the great teams of all time. It's like if you're Orgeron, do you really need to coach again? Like Saban sort of feels like the kind of guy that a certain part of him probably feels like he needs that a little bit. I don't know that Orgeron feels the same way. Try to find some more. Jerry Popham looking forward to more turmoil there at Florida. Jacob O'Neill. Yeah, listen, we are very family friendly around here. People watch their kids. My kids watch. We try to keep it very family friendly, even more so when we have to. Like the other day, just give you a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. Like even the video that the PGA Tour champions put out of Kirby Smart with Patrick Harrington, we even edited some of that out, even though it was already bleeped, and the gesture that Smart made was not anything too R-rated or anything like that. But we err excessively on the side of being family friendly around here, more so than we need to. And listen, if y'all want the Barstool stuff, there's plenty of places you can go to get that. We're just trying to do something a little different around here. And I'm not even against edgier content. I mean, sometimes I consume edgy content. I just don't produce it. Patrick Lindsay mentioned the Dallas Cowboys, the possible landing spot for Saban. I bet you we get something interesting involving Saban at some point in time. I bet we do. Roger Hall says, I don't know about breaking college football away from the universities. It just doesn't sit right with me. Where we feel the same way about the Dogs, that they are truly a developmental team rather than representing the University of Georgia. I agree with you, Roger. I completely agree with you that I like the system as it is. I don't want it to change. I don't mind paying players. I didn't mind paying them under the table. I would like to see the system change. Let me try this again. What I mean to say is I just don't want to see the system collapse. But what I don't like are the people who are like, well, let's tinker with this part of the system over here, but let's not ask any more other questions about this stuff over here. And if you were a football player, the fact that your money goes to a school that may not represent your values, or your money goes to a sport for athletes that you'll never meet, and they'll never come say thank you. I mean, they'll never walk up to you and say, hey, thank you for paying for my entire thing here. They'll never do that. But if we're going to ask questions about, what's fair for players and how they get paid, think about all the money players generate that goes to things other than them. I just think it's a fair question to ask. Now, if you gave me my choice, let's just keep things as they are and as they have been. But if we're going to start tinkering, then I don't think it makes sense to only tinker with the parts that certain people want to tinker with, and the other parts they sort of pretend like is an unaskable question. That's the part that I don't quite agree with. Let's see what else. We're getting ready to go. Back on YouTube one more time, then we're going to wrap it for today. Five Adam says that Saban will stay retired and do TV, which you're very well right, Adam. He very well might. But I bet you we get a rumor. And I don't think we get a rumor unless he would at least were to consider it or at least like the idea that his name is being kicked around. I believe that's probably the case. All right, we're going to get ready to go for right now. Jonathan Aaron says, how about Saban going back to West Virginia where he's originally from? See, now we're having fun. Now we got some good rumors. Now we're having fun. That's good stuff, Jonathan. And we'll finish with that for today. It's our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Y'all find R.S. Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time, do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that, including, as one of our commenters said a moment ago, not super hot today, but the summer is on its way, which means plenty of hot weather that's going to be here too. So make sure you stay comfortable and cool all summer long by getting that air conditioning unit cooled back down and tuned back up to factory fresh specs. Find them online at rsandrews.com for more on that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our RS Andrews Cool Down, and then DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro prior to that. Have a good day, everybody.